We're here to talk about poetry, so I'm guessing in some of your minds you're like, that's not a really cool thing to hear on a Sunday afternoon. If there's one way, I grew up knowing that if there's one way to put someone to sleep, read a poem to them. For kids, read nursery rhymes. For teenagers, read Tennyson. I have a simple question for you today. What do you think of when you think about poetry? Some of us, we might think of textbooks, or exams, or teachers. Some of us, we might think of our favorite poems, maybe a poem we loved in high school. And unfortunately, for a lot of us, the words boring, dense, pretentious, they might come to mind when we think about poetry. But I know for sure that when most of us, we think of poetry, the first image that comes to our minds is that. Now, that's a fine poem, that's a good poem, but it's also a stereotypical poem. See, a stereotypical poem is a box. Almost every line is the same length. Pretty much every line has a rhyming counterpart. Now, this is not me speaking. This is Google. See, I didn't design this for your benefit. I simply Googled the word poem. And this is what turned up. That's what Google thinks poetry is. Now, this is funny, but why do I have a problem with this? The reason I have a problem with this is because for a lot of us, we think that poetry starts and ends with that, in a little box. So we go through our lives and there's this sort of stigma around poetry, that poetry is boring, poetry is scary, poetry is not for normal people like us, like you and me. Poetry may be for our grandfathers or their grandfathers, but certainly what does a 22-year-old Indian have to do with poetry? So I grew up thinking that there are only two things to poetry. One, it has to rhyme. So if your poem does not rhyme, you could not convince me it's a poem, whatever you said. Two, if a poem does not send you running for a dictionary, it's not a good poem. I don't care who the poet is. If I'm not having to look up every word I read, it's a bad poem. So you can't say happy. You have to say jocular. You can't say, today I feel happy. You have to say, on this day, I doth feel felicity. And then I came across this thing called slam poetry. For those of you who don't know, slam poetry is basically performance poetry. Poetry that's written to be performed for an audience. And the first time I saw a slam poetry video on YouTube, I'll never forget that day. It smashed open the mind. It smashed open the possibilities of what poetry is and could be. Suddenly, poetry wasn't textbooks or dictionaries. Poetry wasn't rhymes. Poetry was living and breathing, speaking to me. Poetry was relevant. Poetry was real. And I found that beautiful. After slam poetry, my definition of poetry changed. When I think about poetry, I don't think about pretentious or dense or boring. I now think of the image of a poet on stage, laying his emotions bare for the audience to see, taking risks, speaking truths, speaking his emotion to the audience. And that's what slam poetry is for me.
So let me take you back to the year 1984. In the year 1984, a blue-collar worker, a construction worker who goes by the name of Mark Kelly Smith, gave birth to the slam poetry movement. Now, for those of you who don't know, poetry slams are competitive events where the poets come up and perform their poems and judges are selected randomly from the audience. Now, the thing about Mark Kelly Smith was, he was a construction worker and a poet. Pretty bad combination, right? And we are talking about 1984 America, when the only way to be a certified poet was if you got your works published in little magazines and journals, and dare a construction worker must try to get his works published in one of these. And this was the case with poetry all across the world. It became this precious thing in ivory towers which the academia fought to protect, and normal people like you and I did not have a chance to enter the sacred realm. And this is what Mark Kelly Smith wanted to break. He went to poetry readings in libraries where the poets would read out their poems from the books, and the audience, after he was done, would clap mechanically for him. He hated this for a simple reason, that the poet did not feel the need to earn appreciation of his audience. So Mark Kelly Smith, along with a bunch of fearless, powerful poets, walked into the Get Me High lounge and gave birth to poetry slams. Now, when you picture Get Me High Lounge, do not picture this polite TEDx stage where the worst thing that could happen to me is that I forget my words and you clap softly. Big deal. But when you picture Get Me High Lounge, picture people sitting in the cafe who are not there for poetry. In fact, for some people, poetry was an unwelcome distraction. But this put actual pressure on the performers. Because now, if a poet performed badly, he'd be booed off the stage. He'd be shooed off the stage. He'd be thrown off the stage. And for all he knew, he'd even be thrown bottles at. Is this a good situation for a poet, having this genuine fear of being booed off the stage? Yes. Because this made him consider his audience. It made him consider the people who were sitting in front of him, because it now broke the wall of separation between the poet and the audience. And this opened doors of poetry. It brought poetry back to the people, and it's because of this defining ethos, this realness, this actuality, this sense of bringing poetry back to the people, that poetry slams are now thriving in more than 100 countries in the world.
And that's the image that defines slam poetry for me. Nothing else but the image of these 8 poets back in Chicago, back in 1984, having to jump and shout and dance on stage just to get the audience's attention. As a poet, it made poetry more real. It gave poetry back to people like me and you. See, growing up, I always thought that the only things you can write poetry about are nature or mythology or important topics that mattered. But after I found slam poetry, I found you can write about anything. You can write about cricket or football or chocolate. You can write about getting bored while sitting on the last bench of class. But you could also write about loneliness and depression and anxiety. You could write about coming out of the closet, about friendship. You could write about activism. Suddenly, you could write about anything that mattered to you, that affected you personally, that changed your life. Spoken word and slam poetry became this mouthpiece, this loudspeaker, and this slam poetry is often criticized because people say that a lot of poetry slams are dominated by oppressed communities or minority communities. And while that's a criticism, I honestly see that as one of the most beautiful things about slam poetry, that it provides a stage for people who have no other place to speak up, for people who can't turn to the mainstream media, to guys who can't pay off the government. It's people like this who need a stage, and this is what slam poetry gives them. So when I see poetry, I don't see textbooks, I see this. What do you think about when you think about poetry in Jordan? Let me take you there, back to 2013, to one of the oldest neighborhoods in Jordan, to a brightly lit room. Furniture lines the walls. A few people sit on the floor in the center of the room, and a poet stands at the end. She opens her mouth and begins to speak. "Tell your governments," she says. "Tell your governments, the only kingdom my generation will bow to is the one between our temples. For it is the most compassionate authority we have ever known." This is the underground female slam poetry scene in Jordan. Aisha, one of the organizers of this poetry slam, she says in an interview that the reason they love it is because it's the only place where a woman can talk about liberation and politics and sexuality, and no one is shocked. This is the one place where they can be themselves. What do you think about when you think about poetry in Brazil? Let me take you there, to an old amphitheater where a group of slam poets are huddled up, listening to one another perform their poems. At the end of the night, a man walks up on stage. He doesn't perform a poem. He tells the crowd that he's been working with kids in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Brazil. And he tells them, never stop performing, because we are the bridges that can cross any river. This is what I see when I see slam poetry.
What do you picture when you picture poetry in the US? Go back to 1984 or 2000 or as recent as 2016. Picture a set of young black boys or queer poets or trans people or prison inmates telling their story just as it is. No sugarcoating, nothing. When Saul Williams, one of the most respected poets across the world, talks about slam poetry, he does not talk about the competition or the prize. He talks about a home for young black boys to find their voice, to express themselves, to find meaning in life. At this time, when you hear stories every week of black men being shot on the streets, that's when you realize the importance for them to find a place to find home. At this time in India, when you hear stories every week of women being raped or molested, when you hear stories of men being beaten up, or queer poets, queer people fighting for their rights, that's when you realize the importance of slam poetry, of people finding a place for themselves, finding home. So we are done with our talk, but it would be a shame if we left the stage without performing a poem for you. So here it is.
Louder than silence.
Louder than songs.
Louder than anger.
Louder than teardrops.
Louder than nightmares.
Louder than fear.
Louder than failure.
Louder than fire.
Louder than the wind chimes of despair.
Louder than the slow thud of regret.
Louder than the alarm clock of surprise.
Louder than the high-pitched howl of death.
Louder than a red mark on a 10th standard report card.
Louder than the escaping sobs from a teenager's broken heart.
Louder than the cries of a mother as she tries to close the stab wounds on her daughter's bleeding breast.
Louder than the explosion of brick and mortar, cracked bones, torn eyelids, split flesh.
There are times.
There are always times.
Of clenched fists and closed eyes.
Of broken watches and stopped hearts.
There are times.
Of knees on the floor.
Of begging for forgiveness.
Of having nowhere to go.
Of wishing someone would give you a chance to do it all again.
There are times.
Of black skies and forked tongues.
When the snakes twist themselves around your body and squeeze the air out like toothpaste.
When you look in the mirror.
And the mirror tells you it's not worth it.
And the mirror tells you you're not worth it.
And the mirror tells you.
To slow down.
To stay down.
To give up.
So give up.
So give.
Up.
Give.
Up.
Wait.
Up.
Wait.
Up.
Sit.
Up.
Sit.
Up.
Hold.
Up.
Look.
Up.
Dust.
Down.
Crawl.
Up.
Climb.
Up.
Climb.
Up.
Pull.
Up.
Run.
Up.
Keep.
Up.
Keep.
Up.
Breathe.
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 Because there are times.
When the universe tells you.
It's wiser to stay down.
To keep your back stuck to the ground.
And it's at these times.
That you must look up.
That you must shake up.
It's at these times.
That you must punch the universe in its goddamn gut.
Wrestle the dead stars in black sky.
Because you are here and you remain.
Louder than the apocalypse.
Louder than a thunderstorm.
Louder than the bang, bang, bang of a 10,000-member firing squad.
Louder than the howls your heart heard when the clock ticked down to 0.
Than the scars on your knuckles from your punches on the walls.
From the voices in your head telling you you're not good enough.
Than the scratches on crashed cars in which you'd hidden all your love.
Than the falling twin towers and the everyday airstrikes.
Than the broken windows and burning trains.
Than the crashing cries for help under 100-feet waves.
Than the soundtrack of Aleppo's 1,000-day death.
Than the splitting crossroads.
And the crumbling bridges.
And the cracking buildings.
And the nuclear fissions.
Than the last gasp of the child.
Whose eyes are brown.
Who takes one last gulp of seawater.
Before he gives up.
His lungs stare.
His eyes close.
And his heart drowns.
Louder than the anger.
Louder than the pain.
Louder than the pity.
Louder than the hate.
Louder than the sunrise.
Than the sound of falling rocks.
Than the rain on ruined castles.
Than the ticking of the clock.
Because there are times when the world turns to shit.
And the sky goes dark.
And the snakes beat the angels.
But remember, always remember,
to let the light inside your mind
speak louder than the worms inside your brain.
Because you are here.
You are here.
And you remain. Thank you.